The morning air was thick with the promise of chaos when the neighborhood group chat exploded with Karen's latest decree. My wife, newly pregnant and glowing with anticipation, was to be fined for daring to park her car a mere inch over an imaginary curb line. She announced it with the pomp of a monarch issuing a royal edict, demanding public shaming and punitive action, insisting that motherhood offered no immunity against HOA codes. Across our manicured lawns, blinds twitched, neighbors exchanged nervous glances, and the rumor mill churned with speculation about whether the expectant mother would face humiliation in the same community center where she had once volunteered, her hands helping wrap meals for seniors on Thanksgiving. I watched from our back porch as Karen's silhouette, broad and imposing, lounged in her electric golf cart, issuing commands through her walkie-talkie as though she was coordinating a tactical raid rather than small-town ordinance enforcement. Anger ignited in my chest, but I knew retaliation required strategy, not a loud confrontation that would only play into her narrative of victimhood. Instead, I dug through public records and discovered she had quietly approved an unauthorized addition to her own home, a month earlier, an extra guest room, complete with a lavish en-suite bathroom, built without permits or any oversight. That construction had scraped away acres of protected soil, endangering the floodplain below. Armed with proof, I confronted her privately, expecting her to back down when faced with her own hypocrisy. Instead, she laughed a cruel, high-pitched cackle that echoed through her kitchen as she turned away, dismissing regulations when they served her. I realized then that exposing her would demand more than polite appeals to justice. It would require shining sunlight into every shadow she'd carved into this community. I invited her to a mediation session at the same community center where she scheduled my wife's hearing, under the guise of seeking a compromise. News of the meeting spread like wildfire. The pregnant volunteer versus the autocratic HOA president was the kind of spectacle neighbors craved. When the day arrived, the room was packed. Elderly couples who had once applauded Karen's strict rule enforcement, young families who tiptoed around her petty fines, and reporters from the local paper who sensed blood in the water. I sat at the front table with a folder of blueprints, soil reports, and photographs documenting her illegal construction, while Karen arrived in her signature leopard print blouse, her Rolls-Royce parked conspicuously at the center of the circular drive, angled for maximum effect. Cameras flashed as she swept into the room, confident her performance would cow the room into submission, only to find every seat already occupied by witnesses eager to testify about the water runoff that flooded their yards, the silent creek the HOA claimed to protect now sullied by her vanity project. Her eyes narrowed as I began to speak, revealing the records I'd unearthed. The crowd murmured as each piece of evidence was laid bare. She sputtered, her composure fracturing. She pointed at me, accusing me of defamation, but her voice trembled beneath the veneer of outrage. My wife, seated to my right, glowed with quiet strength, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Even the HOA board members Karen had always controlled looked uneasy, exchanging guilty glances that betrayed their allegiance to truth over loyalty. The mediator called for a recess, but no one budged. Faces turned toward Karen, expecting her next move, and saw not the all-powerful figure they knew, but a frightened woman realizing her empire of intimidation was crumbling. In the hush that followed, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. It was Mrs. Alvarez, a soft-spoken retiree who had once voted in lockstep with Karen on every minor dispute. She rose from her seat, her walker tapping on the linoleum floor, and recounted how she'd fallen during the heavy rains brought by Karen's illegal grading, injuring her hip and requiring surgery. She held a folder of medical bills in one hand and a faded photo of her garden in the other, now gone. Tears glistened on her cheeks as she addressed Karen directly. "You told me it was for the good of the neighborhood. I nearly lost my independence because you wanted a bigger guest room." The room fell silent again as Karen's gaze flicked toward the photo, her bravado draining away. The unspoken truth hung in the air. Her punishments for trivial infractions paled in comparison to the real damage she'd inflicted. Karen's face turned ashen. She stammered, her carefully rehearsed comebacks evaporating. For a moment, she seemed lost, like a queen who'd been dethroned. Then, in a final act of desperation, she lunged for her walkie-talkie, her voice cracking as she tried to command the board members to retreat, to end the meeting. But the board members, emboldened by the truth, refused. The local press, sensing a genuine scandal, began filming live as Karen's authority unraveled. Her golf cart sat idle outside, a symbol of her control muted by the collective will of the community she'd once dictated. When the meeting reconvened, the mediator announced that Karen's unauthorized construction would be torn down at her expense, her fines would be rescinded, and a formal apology must be issued to my wife and the neighbors she had harmed. Karen's shoulders sagged as she nodded numbly, her fury extinguished under the bright overhead lights. My wife reached out to shake her hand, offering forgiveness with the quiet dignity of someone who knew true strength. Karen recoiled, then accepted the gesture with reluctance, and in that moment, I saw the woman beneath the monster she had become, a woman who had wielded power out of fear and insecurity. Word of Karen's downfall spread beyond our little subdivision. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled HOA Queen Toppled by Volunteers Proof, while neighbors spoke openly about the importance of accountability and the danger of unchecked authority. My wife's second trimester progressed without further incident. Her laughter returned as neighbors delivered meals and helped with yard work. The community center, once Karen's stage, transformed into a place of true collaboration. A shared garden replaced the dais where she'd once sat in judgment, and board meetings adopted a new format, ensuring all voices were heard. Karen herself began to volunteer alongside my wife, a humbling assignment that forced her to confront the damage she'd done, and to earn back trust one meal served at a time. As the sun set on our cul-de-sac, I stood by the wooden fence that bordered our yard, the same fence Karen had once threatened to fine for its meager inch of exposed posts. A neighbor approached with a cake decorated with little footprints, to celebrate our growing family. We laughed together about Karen's fall from grace, how easily power had blinded her, how justice had reclaimed the narrative. In that moment I realized that true strength was not in domineering others, but in standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. If Karen ever tries to wield her authority again, she'll face a community fortified by truth, compassion, and shared purpose. And my wife will never walk those lawns alone again. Now I invite you readers, what do you think? Was Karen's public shaming justified? Or did the means undercut the message? Share your thoughts, right or wrong. From that day on, the neighborhood felt different, as though a heavy curtain of fear and silence had been lifted and replaced with something lighter and stranger hope, perhaps. My wife and I walked past the community center every afternoon on our way to the park bench beneath the old oak, her hand resting gently on her swelling belly, his fluttering kicks signaling the new life growing stronger by the day. At first, Karen avoided eye contact, skulking past our driveway as if expecting a fine for daring to breathe her air. But over time her gait softened. She no longer barreled toward the boardroom with textbook precision, her walkie-talkie clipped to her waist like a gaudy badge. Neighbors who once whispered curt salutations now nodded and smiled, a simple acknowledgement of one another's humanity, rather than the tight-lipped fear that had defined life under her reign. On the weekends, small clusters of families gathered to repaint the faded lines of the basketball court she'd once condemned for unauthorized recreation, and my wife, clutching a paintbrush, laughed freely as she flicked droplets of yellow onto the asphalt, baptizing it anew. Karen watched from her porch, a shadow perched on white wicker, until the day our neighbor Mrs. Patel, a grandmother with nimble fingers, knocked on Karen's door, offering her a folded quilt the neighborhood had stitched together. Squares of bright fabric emblazoned with phrases like second chances and community first. It was the moment I knew change was possible, when Karen took the quilt into her arms, her eyes brimming with tears so sudden and overwhelming that she trembled under the weight of both the blanket and her own shame. The next morning, she appeared at the edge of our yard holding 2 mugs of coffee, gingerly offering one to my wife. "For strength," she whispered. And though my wife hesitated, she accepted it, a gesture neither of us felt comfortable with until that point. As summer ripened into the golden haze of late July, the story of our humble victory over the Queen of Ordinances spread beyond our subdivision. Local reporters tracked down the very blueprints we'd submitted and narrated them on the evening news. A rogue room addition built at the expense of the watershed, illegal fines levied against a pregnant woman, and a once feared HOA president undone by the very laws she'd twisted. Calls poured in from homeowners associations in nearby towns, seeking guidance on how to prevent similar abuses. Our mediator, now a friend, was invited to speak at City Hall about transparent governance, and I joined him at a panel discussion titled Power, Accountability, and the American Neighborhood, a surreal honor that my 18-year career as a graphic designer could never have predicted. Traveling across the city in a borrowed car packed with our newborn's bassinet, my wife and I listened as community leaders debated the need for checks and balances, term limits for board members, and mandatory community service hours for HOA officers. Somewhere between the applause and the quiet tips of toques from elderly veterans, I realized that our fight had become part of a larger story, a cautionary tale against letting personal vendettas masquerade as public duty. Back home, the baby shower was a revelation of genuine warmth. We'd expected a polite gathering, but what arrived was a kaleidoscope of neighbors bearing casseroles, diapers, tiny booties, and hand-knit hats. Even Karen contributed a pair of pastel blankets stitched with tiny footprints and "Welcome, Little One" embroidered along the hem. She did not approach my wife directly. Instead, she found me in the backyard, her shoulders slumped, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay." It was the most profound apology I'd ever received, spoken not in the echo chamber of a judgmental audience but in the quiet hush of early evening, when cicadas droned like distant applause. Yet redemption isn't a straight line. A twist emerged when an anonymous tip reached the county prosecutor suggesting that some board members had colluded with Karen to hide evidence of environmental damage beyond her own property. Perhaps the creek's contamination extended farther than we thought. Overnight, a new investigation began. Rumors reignited. Old fears flickered in the eyes of those who had begun to trust again. I feared we were sliding back into the same vortex of distrust, but my wife steadied me, reminding me that accountability was not just for the guilty, but for the whole community. We allowed the cleanup to spread, volunteers mapping creek flows, collecting samples, and restoring wetlands with native plants once ripped from the banks. Karen stood lower down the chain of command, wearing rubber boots alongside high school volunteers and preschoolers. Her hands trembled as she watered saplings, her cheeks burning under the sun. When a reporter asked if she felt humiliated, she nodded and said, "I feel responsible." In the lull that followed the investigation's closure, when it was determined that no further criminal charges were warranted, because the board had self-corrected and remediated the damage, Karen's presence at community events shifted from obligatory to authentic. Her laughter at the annual fall festival was genuine as she chased cotton candy from a child's stick, handing out balloon animals she'd struggled to twist into recognizable forms. The HOA board rewrote its bylaws to limit fines to a maximum of $100 and required all decisions to pass a community vote, not simply a nod from the president. New roles emerged: a neighborhood ombudsperson for voicing complaints, and a rotating community projects coordinator, to ensure that anyone imposing rules also pitched in to build block parties. My wife chaired the first meeting of the Legacy Committee tasked with planting a grove of oaks in the park while Karen offered to draft the events program. When Karen's words faltered, my wife reached across the table to steady the pages, a silent acknowledgement that rebuilding trust required moments of kindness as much as triumph. Our child arrived on a crisp autumn morning, his wails cutting through the stillness of dawn like a declaration of victory. We named him Samuel after my grandfather, a World War II vet whose strict discipline had once inspired Karen's admiration of order. At the hospital, Karen arrived bearing a stuffed owl wearing a tiny HOA cap, a wink at our shared history of codes and reassessments. She held my wife's hand as she wept with joy and exhaustion, her own tears mingling in the swirl of diapers and scrub caps. By the time we returned home, every porch lamp along the street glowed in welcome, and neighbors lined the sidewalk to cheer our new addition. The wooden board that had once declared pregnant wife under Karen's radar now stood repurposed as a signpost for "Welcome Home, Baby Samuel," painted in cheerful pastels and dotted with children's handprints. As winter crept in, we faced new challenges: icy sidewalks, frozen pipes, the heartbreak of a young family forced to leave when their rental's roof collapsed under snow, but we faced them together. Karen was there, shoveling driveways, handing out hot cocoa, and helping string lights on our front hedge so Christmas visitors could find the house easily. When the power flickered and went out one evening, she and I crawled under the floorboards to clear ice in the generator's lines, an ironic throwback to the floods she'd once blamed on our careless landscaping. Later, as we sat in the flickering glow of candlelight, she admitted she'd learned more about community in the past 6 months than in all the years she'd wielded her HOA gavel. In the quiet moments when Sarah rocked baby Samuel by the fireplace, she'd tell him stories of courage and compassion. How Papa stood up to an unjust ruler, how neighbors rallied to protect one another, and how even those who missed the mark can find redemption if given a chance. Samuel cooed at the crackling fire, his wide eyes reflecting dancing flames, and I knew he understood, in his own newborn way, the power of standing together, of forgiveness woven through the fibers of shared struggle. On the night of the annual Winter Gala, the community center was transformed into a twinkling cave of crystal icicles and evergreen garlands. A table held photographs from the year, the once dilapidated creek bed before restoration, the hand-painted basketball court lines, the newborn Samuel swaddled in Karen's pastel blanket. As a hush fell, the new board president, a young teacher named Marcus, took the stage. He spoke not of bylaws or fines but of unity, of how the real victory lay not in dethroning one person but in empowering an entire neighborhood to care for its weakest, to nurture its dreams, and to forgive the flaws that make us human. When he concluded, the audience rose in applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the rafters, and Karen, standing at the back in her familiar leopard print coat, looked on with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time. She caught my gaze across the room and nodded, a simple gesture heavy with gratitude and humility. I raised my glass to her and toasted, "To new beginnings," and the room joined in chorus. Outside, under a sky dusted with snowflakes, my wife and I walked home arm in arm with baby Samuel sleeping softly against her shoulder. We paused at the old oak, now adorned with twinkling lights, and I whispered, "We did it." She smiled, her breath clouding in the cold night air, and replied, "We all did it." As we slipped inside our warm home, the last echoes of that year's journey, shocks, reckonings, tenderness, and renewal followed us like a promise that even the bitterest conflicts can yield the sweetest fruits when met with courage, truth, and an open heart. Now, dear reader, I leave you with this. In the face of adversity, would you stand up alone, or would you invite your neighbors to stand with you? Share your thoughts, right or wrong.